you and I find ourselves in this uncomfortable season of our human family's life together, a season of fear. And we were reminded at the beginning of this Advent sermon series that a little bit of fear goes a very long way. And once a little bit of fear makes its way into your soul and into your imagination, it can come to pollute the way you interact with everything that's happening around you. So this Advent, we have been listening to the stories of Christ's first coming as a way of hearing from God's Spirit how we might be a people who have our fear confronted by the power of a God who is courageous, a God who is fearless. We began by listening to the story of Zechariah the priest, who was told by the angel Gabriel that his family would bear the new Elijah, the one who would help prepare the way of the Lord. That person became John the Baptist. And because wise, religious, experienced Zechariah decided that it was his job to question the way the Almighty was going to make things happen, the angel declared that Zechariah would be mute until John was born. We were reminded by that story that our God helps us to overcome our fear by calling us to times of silence. Jesus himself practiced this silence before his Father, and you and I are invited into that practice as well. If you are busy, running, and don't take time, sometimes, we're warned in the story of Zechariah, sometimes if you don't choose to include silence in your life before your God, the silence will find you. And you will have no choice but to be mute before your God. So choose it before you don't have a choice. Then last Sunday, we heard the story of the angel Gabriel's visit to St. Joseph. And we were reminded about the importance of naming Jesus. St. Joseph literally was called by God to impart the name Jesus to the newborn king. That name gets at a title, an ancient title that the Jewish people were holding in their hearts for the coming Messiah. That title is Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And in that Advent story, we're reminded that a big part of confronting our fear is boldly calling out the ways that God is present and active in our lives. I know that as Protestants, we sometimes are bashful about making the claim of where God is showing up in our lives. We don't want to sound like Pentecostals who talk as though Jesus is their boyfriend and who talk as though they just had lunch with the risen one yesterday. We don't want to be the kind of people that presume that kind of proximity to God when we're not actually sure what's going on. On the other hand, we cannot be functioning like de facto atheists who assume that the clockmaker God just stays up in heaven and never interacts with us. There's got to be a middle road. The middle road is represented by St. Joseph, naming the ways that God is with us in our life, naming them with courage, but also leaving ourselves open to correction when we get it wrong. And sometimes we get it wrong. In between the stories of those two holy men, there was the story of young Mary and her prayer. This young woman, not much older than one of our confirmands, who, when told that she would be the one, the vessel for the coming of God's incarnate self, that she just says yes. Let it be with me according to your word. Let it be with me according to your will. That young woman says yes, even though she must understand that there is danger and disappointment ahead for her on that path. It won't be easy. She knows that, but it will be worth it. That story from young Mother Mary continues today. After she says her yes to God's will for her life, she makes her way out of town to go visit her cousins, John and Elizabeth. She walks into their home and just says, "Shalom." Hi. And that simple greeting is enough to cause the insides of her cousin Elizabeth to jump for joy. When I am praying for you, you people of peace, one of my prayers is that you would be the kind of people that when you walk into a room and you say, "Good morning, hello, peace," that when you do that, the people around you would leap for joy on their insides. That your friendship with God and the Spirit would be so right that just your hello and a smile would be enough to brighten someone's day. If, this is a little tangential, but if you are the kind of person who walks into a room and people start to look away, then maybe we have a little bit of work to do. But I want you to be aware of that. I want you to be aware of that. But that's not actually the sermon. That would be the sermon if I were preaching on young Mother Mary's greeting and the power of it. I am actually preaching on what happens next. St. Elizabeth is definitely not a Lutheran, because when she experiences that leap of joy on her insides, when John the Baptist jumps in her belly at the greeting of the Mother of God, St. Elizabeth actually tells Mary what she has experienced. And one of the things that I have come to realize about life and ministry among the frozen chosen is that many times, many of you are experiencing God's presence, God's power, and yet you keep it to yourselves. And I don't know if it's because maybe you don't want to sound like you've swallowed the Holy Spirit, feathers and all, and that folks will think you're somehow weird, or because you might imagine in your spiritual humility that sharing those kinds of stories about how God has touched your life would somehow seem like you were bragging or showing off. I don't know exactly what your motive might be for holding it back, but St. Elizabeth's example calls us beyond that bashfulness or that humility or that lack of confidence in our spiritual experience and calls us to share stories. If we as a congregation want to become a people in God who are having our fear overcome and are helping others to have their fear overcome by the same power of God, then, brothers and sisters, we must get much better at telling our stories. Telling our stories to the members of our family, telling our stories to one another. I remember back when I was serving on the east side of the valley, we had a gentleman in the congregation, very soft-spoken guy, And that soft-spoken gentleman had experienced tragedy in his life. He had a beautiful, loving, best friend for a wife. And she died suddenly, unexpectedly, tragically. And he was completely heartbroken. And then he, in the midst of his mourning, he had a dream. And in his dream, Jesus told him that it was time to go to church. And God bless him, he decided to make that wager, the kind of wager that St. Paul and his missionary team made, the kind of wager that we as mainline Protestants are being called to make, the wager that maybe that was actually a God thing. So he went to church. And that little Lutheran church on the east side of town happened to be the church that he went to. He didn't tell anyone this story at first, but then, God bless him, he shared this story with a couple of the guys. Boy, let me tell you, that's the thing, brothers and sisters, if we can get past the point where the only small talk we make with one another is the weather and the sports games, if we can grow in maturity so that we move beyond the small talk of weather and sports games and into the deep waters of what God is up to in our lives, it can change things. And when he shared that story, it helped that congregation to understand that God was not done with them, that Jesus Christ was the senior pastor of their congregation, that there was so much more that God had in store for them, and it wasn't just about architecture and bills and sports teams and weather reports. It was about encountering the living God who desires to see our whole human family transformed by God's love. You and me included. When St. Elizabeth shares with young Mary her praise report, just hearing your voice, just hearing your greeting made my insides and the little one therein leap for joy. And blessed are you, my young cousin, who believes there will be a fulfillment of what God has promised to you. Elizabeth uses that storytelling to bless her young cousin and help her to answer the call into her ministry. And then Mary launches into this hymn of praise that the church calls the Magnificat. And we're going to use that as our confession of faith following the sermon. She jumps off of this praise report with praise of her own. And in her own praise, Mary claims the truth that all of the suffering that lies ahead will ultimately be worth it. So rather than being a person who's a habitual complainer, and you think your complaining is helpful to the world, to God, to the people around you, rather than being someone who is bashful and shy and never tells the stories of how the people in your life are being used by God to bless you and to make your insides leap for joy. Rather than being any of that, follow in St. Elizabeth's footsteps. Tell the stories. When you gather with your families, whether it's in the same room physically, or whether you only get to interact with them over Zoom or FaceTime, tell them the stories. Tell them you love them. Tell them about how you met them and how special they were to you when you met them. Tell them about how you fell in love. Tell them about how you overcame disappointment. Tell the stories. And in the spirit of Elizabeth, if you're going to tell any story at all, tell about how God used that person to bless you. Tell them what a difference they have made in your journey of faith. Don't just talk about the weather, sports. For God's sake, don't talk about politics. Tell the stories of how God used those blessed people around you to bless you. And you will see, there's this great video out there. This is a little bit like this. Oh, I wish I had thought of this ahead of time because I would show you the video. A guy conducted an experiment. He went out on the street with his phone camera, and he walked up to random people, and when he walked up to the random people, he would simply say, "You look beautiful today." And in the course of the video, he then was able to record what a difference that made in the way the person was presenting to the world. Without exception, cheeks blushed, smiles grew, eyes sparkled. You have the power to do that for the people in your household. You have the power, by God's grace, to do that for the people in this church. You, by the power of God and in the spirit of St. Elizabeth, you have the power to do that for strangers at the grocery store, for long-lost friends and relatives that you're able to reconnect with. You have the power. And in the spirit of St. Elizabeth, I hope that you will be that kind of blessing to the people in your lives. Tell the stories. Tell the stories about them. Don't wait till their funeral to tell the good stories about them. Tell the good stories about them to their face, and do it while we're still here on earth instead of waiting till one of us is in heaven.